Hi everybody, Dave Thomas here again, and today I am building the Estes Olympus payloader model rocket. Estes considers this an advanced kit. However, it's really not that difficult. What makes this kit advanced is we are going to be using multiple types of materials here. So some clear plastic, probably polycarbonate, as well as the cardboard of the body tube and the motor mount and wood fins here. But if you've built some of the intermediate rockets that also use the balsa wood fins and such, this is an easy step up. The main things that are going to be different here are, first of all, this is a mid-power rocket, so it flies on D and E engines, and even a few F and G composite engines. And it uses this Pro Series engine retaining ring, and this has to be applied using epoxy. And so this is one of the other reasons why this is considered an advanced kit. If you haven't worked with epoxy before, this is going to be something a little bit new to you. And it's really not as hard as everybody makes it sound. It's just another type of glue, and you have to work fairly quickly with it. So for our parts here, we do have the main body tube, our payloader tube, which is the clear one. Now this is a combination of the nose cone and a coupler for the payload bay, and so these are going to be separated at some point. A small parts bag here. This contains our engine retainer, the engine block, the shock cord, and the launch lug. And this is a 3/16" launch lug, so you will need a mid-power rocket launcher to launch this. Okay, we also have the engine mount tube and a spacer tube, and a lot of times this gets put inside here, so if you don't find it right away, that's probably where it is. And then in this package we have the fin material and the centering rings, as well as the instructions and a sheet of decals in here. These are water slide decals, and so that's something else that makes this kit a little bit more advanced. If you've never done them before, they're not that hard. There are lots of videos out there, including some of my own. Alright, we've got all our parts here, and I will clear away the whole package, and we will get started on our build. Now with any model rocket, it's a good idea to go and read completely through the instructions before you start building. Likewise, if you are using this video as a guide, I highly recommend watching the entire video before building the kit. And because there are going to be some places, like right now, where you might want to skip ahead a little bit. So normally, preparing the fins would be the second major step. However, I want to apply some sanding sealer to my fins, and so that's going to take some time to dry. And so I'm going to go ahead and prepare the fins now, and while the sanding sealer is drying on those, then I'll come back and do the motor mount. So coming down here, first, while the fins are still within the stock, take some medium to fine sanding paper. I'm using 120 grit here, and just sand both sides of the sheet. And this just removes any really raised grain on here. And then flip it over and do the other side. Now this works best with a sanding block or sanding tee where you have a flat surface on the sandpaper. If you don't have those, you can just do this with a sheet of sandpaper in your hand. It may not be exactly flat, but you'll still be able to remove any really raised grain here. Okay. Now beyond this is up to your personal preference, time, and how much detail you want. So according to the instructions, they're not doing anything else to the fins except gluing them together. So what I'm going to do now is go through that next step. So I'm going to just cut through all the little tabs here. Alright, and then the remainder of this balsa can be discarded. Personally, I keep a box of old balsa like this so I can use it later. And now I'm going to take just a flat piece of sandpaper on my work surface, and I'm going to stack the pieces together here. So we'll come back to those little ones in just a moment. But here we want to get everything lined up. Make sure all the edges are the same here. And then once you've got that, just drag it across the sandpaper on each edge a few times. And this will remove any remaining material from the cutting of these. So you've got these little nubbins here that we cut through. And occasionally you might have one fin that's just a little bit bigger than the others, and this helps even them out. In each case, make sure you push them so they're all even up there. Okay, and then we're going to do the same for these. Now these are going to be part of the fins. They'll be glued onto the front of the main fins here. And this is another reason why this is considered an advanced kit, because we actually have to assemble a complex fin out of parts. I'm going to do the same thing we did before and just give it a couple of strokes on each edge. Okay, and now we're going to glue these together. Now I mentioned sealing these, so if you're going to use sanding sealer on these fins, do it after you've glued the front portions to the main part of the fin, and then seal the whole thing at once. For this next part, you'll need a disposable smooth surface. I'm using aluminum foil here. A plastic sheet or some wax paper will work as well. And we're going to glue the small front piece onto the main part of the fin so that when we're finished, it'll be connected like that. And we'll do this for all 4 fins. This is going to be a case where less is better when it comes to gluing this. So here, I'm going to apply some of my wood glue. White glue will work as well. And I just want a little bit here. Now even that is probably too much. And what I'm going to do here first is stick the two together. Okay, and I'm going to bring them back apart. And I'm just going to use my finger to smooth that out and remove some excess. Okay, now this part you got to do fairly quickly. While that glue is there, I'm going to stick these together. And then you can use a ruler or other straight edge to make sure that everything is aligned. And go ahead and press down on this. You don't want any ridges here. And then just let that sit and dry for at least half an hour. I'm going to go off camera here and do this to the other 3 fins and then come back. While the fins are drying, we can go back now and do the motor mount. And the first step is to install the thrust ring here, or engine block. Now, if and only if you plan to fly this on composite engines and never on black powder engines, you can omit this. And in fact, if you're going to fly this on composite engines, by omitting this, you can put larger engines in here. Most composite engines, though, will still fit even with the ring in place. And you will probably want to be able to fly on Estes black powder engines anyway. So, unless you really think you're going to stick a really long composite engine in this, go ahead and add the thrust ring. That being said, we will go ahead and measure this. So take the spacer tube and measure 10 millimeters or 3/8 of an inch from one end. Okay, and this is going to be used along with the thrust ring here to space it. Now, I haven't put any glue or anything like this in, but what we're going to do is after there's glue in here, we'll put this in, slide it forward until we reach that 10 millimeter mark. And that will put the thrust ring where it needs to be. And if you kind of look where that is, our next task here is to add the glue. Now, just to keep from getting mixed up here, I am going to write aft on the back end of my engine mount so I don't end up getting it turned around when I go to assemble the other parts. Okay, so now I'm going to apply a bead of glue roughly 1 centimeter inside the forward end, all the way around there. You can be fairly generous with that. It doesn't need to be sloppy. And now I'm going to go ahead, take my thrust ring, put that in the aft end, take my spacer tube, and push that up into the glue. So right at my mark there, and if I look in the front end, then I've got glue coming up all the way around there. Okay, I'm going to take that out in case there's glue that got past it. We don't want to glue this inside. And now I'm going to take my finger and just spread that glue around into a fillet. Okay, it looks like I used a little bit more than I really needed to, but it's not going to hurt it. Okay. And if you want, you can just wipe the excess out of there. Alright, now once I've got my glue fillet in place, I'm going to check this once more. And don't shove this up any further, just bring it to the line. And as long as it's where it's supposed to be, then we can take that back out. Okay, and I'm just going to let this dry for a few minutes, and while that's happening, we can cut out the centering rings. These are all identical. With my rings cut out, now I'm just going to take a little bit of fine sandpaper and just lightly sand around the inside here, just to remove any of those little nubbins. And then we can do the same thing on the outside. And just do a little sanding here. Alright, then we can come back to our engine tube, and according to the instructions we need to mark 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters from the aft end. It's going to be right here. And then we need another mark at 2 inches or 5.1 centimeters from the aft end. Okay, and this is where our rings are going to be. So one ring will slide on here, and we'll push it all the way down to that rearmost mark, and then we'll have another one close to the middle there, if not at it, and then the most forward ring is going to be almost flush with the surface or the edge of the motor mount there. Okay, now I can go ahead and leave these in place, so I'm just going to back them off from their marks. So I'm just going to move them forward a little bit. Okay, or you can move them the other direction. And actually for this aft one at least, I'm going to do that because I want a nice smooth surface around here where the engine mount retaining ring is going to go in. So here I'm just going to put a bead of glue now just aft of my mark, and then when I push that ring up, it'll push that glue forward, and it may leave a thin film behind on the engine tube, but that should not interfere with the retaining ring. So now I'm just going to push this and turn it as I come forward. That's gripping really quickly. Okay. Now, something you can do is take the interior piece of the engine retaining ring and push this down over that, and there should be a little bit of clearance there. Okay, so if this is butting up against the ring, it needs to go forward a little bit more. Alright, so that one's in place without any problem. Okay, and I'm just going to do the same thing here. Use a little less glue than I did on the aft one. And then once again I'm going to move this forward until I'm at my line there. Alright, I'm just going to go around here and make sure that it's all at approximately the same level. If it's warping back and forth a lot, you need to adjust that. However, if you're not exactly on that center line, it's fine. It's not going to cause any problems that way. Okay, and then the last one is going to go right up here toward the end. Alright, so here I've got all of my rings in place, and the excess glue now I'm just going to smooth around like that and create a fillet. You can do this on both sides of the rings, but it's not necessary. And again, on the aftmost ring, it's better to leave that alone because we'll be epoxying on the ring there. Alright, so I'm going to set this aside and let all this glue dry. Our next step is to mark the fin lines and the launch lug lines, and for this we need to cut out this tube marking guide. I'm just going to quickly look and see what I'm cutting out. So it's just going to cut out the title here of my instructions. If you want to keep your instructions intact, you can make a photocopy of this and cut it out. I really don't care, so I am going to take my knife here and cut this out. You can also use scissors for this. It's a good idea to have a little bit of masking tape available. So I'm just going to tear off a strip here to keep ready. And now we're going to take the main body tube and wrap this around it. About ½ inch, or 13 to 15 millimeters above the aft end of the tube. Just enough so you can write there. And then we're going to align these two little tick marks. Okay, and once we've got those aligned, go ahead and take your masking tape. And you can stick that loosely on. In fact, if you tack it down a little bit to the body tube, that'll keep this from slipping. I'll just do it up here on the other end as well. Okay, you just want to make sure that you don't interfere with the lines that you need to be able to tick off here. So I'm just going to mark this. And a lot of times I'll just use a little tick mark, but if you put a little arrowhead here, it actually gets you better accuracy. If there are any carpenters among you, I'm sure you've seen this before when you're marking chalk lines. Alright, now this one is a launch lug line. So I'm just going to mark it down here with an LL so I don't try to attach a fin there later. Alright, and then you can just gently remove the tape. Alright, and then you can set this aside. So you can use a door frame here to extend these lines. Now the launch lug line you're going to want to extend all the way down along the tube. The fin lines only need to go up to slightly longer than the fins, so about 1/3 of the way up the tube here. Now it's really hard for me to video a door frame where I can do this, so I'm going to use a tube marking guide. It was also made by Estes. And the trick to this is just finding the right edge. Alright, so here's my launch lug line. So this one I'm going to extend the whole length. Alright, and then the rest of these are fin lines. So they only need to go up about 2/3 there. A little gap in my launch lug line there. I'm just going to fill that in. Okay. Now, something else you can do in preparation for the fins is take some fine sandpaper and along the line here where those fins are going to be, just roughen it up a little bit. It just takes a few strokes. You don't need to go all the way through, but this just roughs up this glassine surface, and it's going to make gluing a little stronger. And don't go too far beyond where the fins are going to be, because otherwise then you have to fill it in with primer to get rid of the rough look to it. And it may be that you'll need to redraw part of your lines here. That's fine. And I'll do a similar type of roughing up of the launch lugs when we get to their application. My engine mount is dry now, and so we're going to put this into the main body tube, and we're going to put the glue on in 2 stages. So the first thing I'm going to do is apply a ring of glue about 2 inches in here, and this is a good time to have some sort of an applicator. Now if you don't have a cotton applicator like this, just a dowel or a scrap piece of balsa will work, but you'll need to be able to get up inside there. At worst, you can always use your finger as well. But I'm just going to measure this at 2 inches here and put my thumb so that my thumbnail acts as a stop. And now I will get some glue on my applicator. And you can use a fairly heavy amount here. So now I'm just going to stick this in till my thumb hits, and then apply that around the inside of the tube there. I don't think I can quite get this under the camera. And now I can look down inside and see where my ring is. And go ahead and apply more glue where I need it. So we want a nice even amount. Now I'm going to put the motor mount in, but only part way. So I'm going to slide this in until I get past that middle ring, and the glue's already starting to grab, so I need to do this next part really quick. I'm going to put another ring of glue just inside this, and the aft ring there will slide through that glue, and that will glue it into place. Okay, so now I'm just going to put this in the rest of the way. And again, do this quick or the forward ring will grab. And now I need this flush, so I'm just going to set this down on the table here. Okay, and then now my motor mount is flush here with the engine, with the main body tube. You can see a little bit of smeared glue there. If there's too much, you can take a fresh applicator and wipe that away, or you use the handle like this and just smooth it out. It's not going to hurt anything. If you want to, you could even put a fillet of glue down around the edge there. I'm not going to worry about it. It's actually filled in fairly well here. And when I go to put the motor retainer on, that kind of slid a little bit, I can also use some leftover epoxy to do that. I'm just going to take my ruler here and redo that. And now I'm just going to let this dry so that it doesn't move anymore. While I'm waiting for the engine mount to dry, we'll come back to working on the fins here. And so I've got the assembled fins, and just want to check through and make sure they're actually all straight. If they're not, really the only thing you can do is just take a hobby knife, separate this, and glue it again. If it's off a little bit, don't worry about it. You can straighten it when you put it onto the rocket. Now keep in mind, this joint is still going to be a weak spot until you get the whole thing glued on the rocket, and that will strengthen it there. So be careful with this. I've decided to use some sanding sealer on my fins before mounting them. And I'm going to use some of this DAP plastic wood. There are other brand names that sell similar types of filler here. And this is a water-soluble, non-toxic filler. And mine's come a little bit separated here, but that's okay. Just take an applicator here. I'm just using a popsicle stick. And it doesn't take much of this because we're going to thin this out here. So I'm just going to take a moderate sized blob. And I'm just putting this into a small cup. Paper cups, you can use reusable cups. Like I said, this is going to wash out with water really well. Here I'm going to add a little water to it, and generally in a ratio of 1 part water to 1 part putty, up to 2 parts water. And so I'm just going to add a little bit here to start with. Mix that up. And what we want here is a flowable slurry, but not so wet that it causes warpage of the fins themselves. Now there are also polyurethane-based sanding sealers out there. They take longer to dry. They're more toxic. They're not really good for younger Rocketeers. Their advantage is that since they're not water-based, they don't warp the wood at all. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add just a little bit more of the putty here. You want this to be about the consistency of thick latex paint. Now, to keep our wood from warping, we want to apply the sanding sealer to both sides very quickly, and then have a little bit of airspace underneath them so that they dry more uniformly. And so you can use some dowels, some scrap wood here. These are actually the handles off some of my applicators. And you can apply this with a paintbrush. I'm going to use a cotton swab here. You can even apply it with your fingers. Okay, I'm going to add just a bit more. So it's looking like, for this particular formulation, about 2 parts putty to 1 part water is going to be optimal. And even within the same brand, they make a squeeze tube version that's got a little bit different consistency as well. So just experiment with a little bit. I know there's an Elmer's version of this that you might mix a little bit differently. That's looking more like it. And then just stir out any lumps. Alright, don't need to worry about gloves or anything unless you just don't want gooey stuff on your fingers. Alright, if you pick up little lumps, that's fine, just spread them out. So here I'm just going to spread this across. Kind of work it into the grain. If you get it on the root edge, it's not a big deal. This stuff sands off really, really easily. And just work all the way around. You can put it onto the edges if you want. Since we haven't shaped these yet, it's not a big deal. Alright, but here's the real trick, is getting both sides done fairly quickly. If you take a long time between the sides, then the water soaks in to one side of the fin, causing it to expand, and that will bend the entire fin. We don't want that. If we get both sides relatively soon, then they both absorb the water at the same rate, and they won't expand as much, and so that should keep them from warping. And again, if they warp a little bit, that's not really a big deal either, because they will straighten out when we glue them to the rocket. If they've got a big warp in them, then yeah, you may have a problem. But usually you don't have a problem with that using this type of material. So as long as you get it all done very quickly. Okay, so you can go ahead and do these edges. They tend to be really porous, and we'll benefit from this. Okay, and so just let this dry, and typically this can be ready to sand in about an hour. A lot of it will be depend on the humidity and temperature where you're working. But this is another advantage of this particular type of sanding sealer over the polyurethane ones, is the polyurethane really has to set for about 24 hours before you can sand it. This stuff within an hour or two. I'm going to finish these off camera, and then we'll come back and continue the build. The sanding sealer is dried, and yeah, it looks kind of lumpy, and that's simply because I used the cotton swab to brush it on. If you use a paintbrush, you'll get a smoother lay down of the sanding sealer, but this isn't a big deal. Like I said, this is going to sand off really, really quickly. And so I'm just going to use a little 150 grit sandpaper here. And you can see that very quickly we're back down to the wood again. And so you actually need to be a little bit careful that you don't go too far with this. And again, be careful around this attachment of the fin here. That is a weak point. Okay, and we're going to do the other side. Alright, and then I'm just going to get the edges quickly here. And then I'm just going to take a tissue here and remove a lot of this dust. And this will also now show you where there's any raised areas here. So I've just got a few that I want to take down. And here I just need to really lightly sand it. Okay, a little bit there. Okay, now you may notice there's just a little bit of a bend in here. That is not a big deal at all. And I won't worry about it until we get these completely finished. Okay. Now, according to the instructions, we should round this forward edge here. Now, again, you're going to have to be really careful with that leading piece here. So I'm just going to take my sandpaper here initially and just gently round over the corners first. Okay, and I'm going to do that on both sides. So right now I'm just lightly rounding the corners. I'm not really trying to get them round at the moment, just making them not into corners anymore. Okay, and then I can gently just kind of roll this back and forth. And I am just doing this forward piece first so I can support it really well. Here, when it hits that angle, it can cause a little bit of a problem. Just take your time with it. Okay, and once you've got the basic shape there, it needs a little bit more. But now I'm going to go on down here. Okay, and do the same thing where first I'm just knocking down those corners a little bit more. And now rotating it back and forth to round the edges. Okay, and if you look at it edge on, then it should be getting round, and mine's a little bit lopsided, so we'll just round this part a little bit more. Okay, it's a little closer, could be a little bit more here. Alright, and now I'm going to just come in here really carefully to put a little bit more attention here in this little crook. Okay, that looks pretty good there. I'm going to do the rest of these off camera, and then once I've got all of them done, I'm going to take some 220 grit sandpaper and just lightly smooth things out. There are a few areas here where you can see a little bit of wood popping up there, and so we'll just smooth those out. And then if your fins still have a little bit of a warp to them, you can stack them all on top of each other with the most warped ones in the middle, and just put a heavy book on them and let them stay overnight, and they should be fine. I finished sanding my fins, and actually ended up cracking one of them right at that glue joint, so it's set aside and is being re-glued. It's not a big deal. By the time I'm ready for the fourth fin, it should be fine. And now we're going to put the fins on the rocket. Now, one thing I want to check before we go any further is to make sure that when the fins are on, I can still see the top of the fin line, so I can use it as a guide. And this looks like it's all going to be fine. Okay, if you have a short line on there, go ahead and take some time to extend it so you'll be able to see what you're doing. For fins, I really recommend wood glue over white glue. White glue does work, it just takes longer to set, while the wood glue gets tacky quicker, and so you don't have to worry about holding the fin for quite as long. And here I'm going to use just a thin film of glue here. Actually a little bit too much there, so I'm going to spread that out. We really don't want a heavy film of glue here because it takes longer to dry. We'll reinforce the fins later with some fillets. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is this corner should be flush with the aft end of the rocket, so I'm just going to set that right here and then touch the glue edge down, and then I'm going to pull it back up, and I'm going to let this set for 30 to 60 seconds to let the glue get tacky. Now that my glue is tacky, I'll go ahead and put this right back on where I had it. And then just press down firmly to re-engage the two sides of the glue. And now I'm going to check first of all from the top down to make sure the fin is straight. And then I'm going to look at it, almost out of room here, there's a long tube. Look at it from the back to make sure that the fin is perpendicular to the surface of the tube. And after this, we just need to be patient. So with wood glue, let this set for at least 15 minutes before you go to the next fin. If you're using white glue, I recommend 30 minutes. And then go on to do the opposite fin so that you can use the initial one as a guide to alignment and then go on and do the opposing fins. Alright, so I'm going to let this dry and then attach the other fins off camera, and then we'll come back when all the fins are on. My fins have dried, and now I need to attach the launch lug, and this needs to go 6 inches from the aft end here along our launch lug line. So it's just going to be right here. And we'll do the launch lug very similar to the way we put the fins on, although we don't need to really have so much tacking time on it. So here I'm just going to run a bead of glue and like we did with the fins, I'm going to stick this on to the line here, pull that back off. But I'm just going to let this go for 15-20 seconds or so. Alright, and now that we're a little bit tacky, put this back on, and now check and make sure that it's straight, seam from the top down. And then I can also sight along the body tube here. Okay, that looks good. So I will let that dry. My next step is to put on the fin fillets, and these are going to reinforce the fins. We'll also put one on the launch lug. And it's a good idea to have some paper towels or tissues or a rag standing by, because we'll be wiping this with our fingers. And occasionally you need to wipe your fingers off. So I'm just going to run a bead of glue along the inside edge here. And I'm just going to take my finger and smooth that in. And any excess I'll just put onto the next fin here. And then just fill in the rest with some more glue. And this is going to reinforce the fin joint, and it also reduces what's called interference drag that happens anytime you have an angle between two surfaces connecting there. Some people like to have really thick fillets that kind of blend the fin completely into the body tube. If you're going to do this, start with a thin fillet of glue like I'm doing here, and then after that's dried, use some wood filler or modeling putty to build up the fillet. Don't make a great big glue fillet on here all at once, because it will sag under its own weight. Alright, and then we just check, make sure we don't have any blobs of glue where we don't want them. Now sometimes bubbles will develop in this, and if that happens, or if you get separation, it's best to let it go ahead and dry and then put another thin coating of glue on over that. So I'm going to set this aside, and you want to keep this horizontal so that the fillets don't flow to one end to the other. And I'm going to let this dry for several hours here to make sure that we don't have wet glue everywhere. And when we come back, we'll start in on the rest of the upper section and the recovery system. My fillets are done, and except for the installation of the shock cord and the engine retainer, this part of the rocket is essentially done. And so I would suggest painting this separately before you do the rest of the construction. So paint it and then go ahead and go to the steps of adding the engine retainer here and putting the shock cord mount and shock cord in at this end. The same is true of the nose assembly. And so if you're going to paint the nose cone, I would go ahead and do that first and then come back and assemble the payload section.